In HTML and CSS, there are two major systems to align things, namely Flexbox and Grid. And in this video, we are focusing on Flexbox, and in the next video, we are going to talk about Grid. Both systems are essential so that you stand any chance at creating a nice website or a nice looking shiny app or anything else that you might want to create with HTML and CSS as a helper. And in case you don't know me, my name is Albert Rapp, and in this series, I help our users to get the most out of web development technologies, because a lot of these technologies can help you create nicer things with R. And with that said, let's dive into Flexbox. So in my Quarto file, I've already put in a code chunk that loads the HTML tools package, because this is the one we're going to use to build all the HTML and CSS within R. And I've already put in a div container and styled it with a width of 300 pixels and height of 300 pixels. And I've used a light gray background. And if you execute this, you will get a gray square that you see here in the viewer pane. And now we can treat our gray box as our canvas to move things around on. So let's fill this container with a couple of other blocks. Here we can just use another div container and set it with some CSS style to width of 50 pixels, height of 50 pixels, using a border and using a red background. That will give us one square within our gray area. And if we repeat this 2 times, then we get 3 squares inside of our box. As you can see, all of these squares were placed on top of each other. So that's the default behavior inside of HTML and CSS, namely things are stacked on top of each other. And if you want to have the red squares next to each other, then you need to change the display of the surrounding container. This means we scroll up, and inside of our style for the outer container, we simply change the display and set it to flex. And that way we have used the Flexbox display style, and by default, Flexboxes will put things next to each other instead of on top of each other. And once you have enabled the Flexbox display, you can also use the 2 main arguments to align things on the main and on the secondary axis. I will explain in a second what the main and secondary axis is. For now, let me just show you that one argument that you need is the justify content property. And if you set this to center, then things will center align on the primary axis. And as you can see here, things moved horizontally into the horizontal center and not vertically. And this already tells you that by default, Flexbox uses the horizontal thing as a primary axis. And if you wanted to change that, then you'd have to change the flex direction and set it to column. By default, it is set to row. And if you set it to column and execute this code, then you'll see that everything center aligns vertically. But also notice that this means that the squares, the red squares, are not placed next to each other, but on top of each other. So the flex direction really tells you in which direction things are stacked. And this is then also automatically the primary axis. And if you wanted to center things on the secondary axis, in this case right now we would talk about centering things horizontally, then you would have to use the other property, which is the align items property. And if you set that to center too, then everything is centered horizontally as well. And now notice what happens if I were to remove the flex direction. Let me just comment this out. Let's just leave the flex direction at the default of row. Then everything would still be center aligned, but the squares would then again be next to each other because the primary axis is then the horizontal one. And then the justify content would move that to the center, just like we've seen before. And align items moves it to the center of the secondary axis. In this case, this means it will move it downward to the vertical center. And if you change the flex direction, then things will turn, because then the red squares will be stacked in the direction of the flex direction, which is column-wise now. And this is why you get a different look here. Okay, so this was just a quick recap of what we've just learned. And really what you have to take away here is that you need to first activate the display flex, and then you can use justify content and align items to move things around according to the 2 axes that you have, horizontal and vertical. But you will have to keep in mind which one of those is the primary axis and which one is the secondary axis. And this is determined by flex direction. And perhaps to make this a little bit more clear, let us move away from using both center on both of the axes. So let's use the flex direction as a default value. Let's just go with the image that we see right now. And then we can, on the align items axis, so in this case the secondary axis, we can move things to the top or to the bottom. And what we need for that is to use the flex and argument, and this will move things to the end of the secondary axis. Similarly, flex start would move things to the top. And once again, if you'd use flex direction and set it to column, then things would be inverted a bit. And flex start in this case would then be correspond to left aligned, and flex and would correspond to right aligned. That's how you can play around with these things. And to show you one more option that we have, let's comment this out here. And then let us not use center or flex start or flex end. All of these things can be used in justify content too. Let us instead use something that we can use inside of justify content, and that is space between. And that way things are stretched out evenly on the axis. And once again, if you set the flex direction to column, then things will flip around again. And finally, there's not only space between, but also space around. This will also space things kind of evenly, but with space between, things are anchored at the start and end of the axis and then stretched out evenly. With space around, you can see here that the squares are not at the end of the axis, which means that they are not at the edge of the gray square. And just like before, if you change the flex direction, then things flip around again. And a great way to practice all of these things with Flexboxes is to play a little game that is called Flexbox Defense, which is a tower defense game where you move around the towers using Flexbox commands. So if you go to flexboxdefense.com, for some reason that website is down right at the time that I want to record, so that's why I'm showing you a screenshot instead. But if that website is up again, then you can play the game, and basically all you have to do is to, on the left hand side, fill in things like justify content and move around the towers that you have. And then you can press start wave. This button will then be green, and then the bubbles will come and your towers will shoot at the bottoms. And if you survive the wave, then you unlock the next level and you can practice more of this moving around stuff. It's a great exercise. That's basically how I learned Flexboxes. So definitely check that out. But before I leave you to do something else, let me show you two more tricks that you can do with Flexboxes. Back in our studio, I want to show you how you can wrap things onto the next row and also how to move things around when the surrounding container is not a Flexbox. Let's start with the first one. Let's first remove everything but the flex display here. Then everything moves back to the top. And then we see here that our gray container has a width of 300 pixels. So let's make our squares a bit larger so that they fill the whole space. So let's use 100 pixels instead, and then apply this to all of the squares. And that way we perfectly fill the gray square, at least the first row of it, with these red squares. The question is now, what happens if I add another container to this? And the surprising result of that is that everything still fits inside, but you can now see that the squares are not really squarish anymore. They're more rectangular shaped now. And that is because by default, a Flexbox row will always shrink the items so that everything fits into the surrounding container. Okay, so because the surrounding container here is a Flexbox and we have put in stuff, namely 4 squares of 100 pixel width each, we have sticked in something that is too large for the width that we have. And to deal with that, Flexboxes will just shrink each individual component, and we can avoid this by setting the flex shrink property and setting that to 0. And now you can see how the first square doesn't shrink anymore because we have disallowed the shrinking by setting flex shrink to 0. And if we do that for all of the containers here, this is starting to go outside of our gray squares. And if we do this for the fourth one as well, we can see all 4 squares out in one row now use their full width and they go outside of the gray container, or at least they go outside of the gray area. And the reason why we a second ago just saw 3 squares was that the 4th squares was shrunk so much that you can barely see it. So that's why when you disable that the last square can shrink, you will see it again. Okay, so but that stuff is definitely ugly and we want to avoid that. And one way to avoid that is to enable flex wrapping in the parent container. So that means at the container that has all of the red squares, we do not only use the Flexbox display, but we also allow for wrapping. This means that we set the flex wrap property to wrap, and then things wrap around. Here it wraps 2 squares because the width of 300 isn't enough to contain 3 squares, because you have to take into account that each square also has a border of 1 pixel thickness on every side. So this means if you would give 305 pixel width, it would be 1 pixel too short to contain 3 squares, including the border. But if you increase that by 1, then you can contain 3 boxes of width 100 plus 3 times 2 borders of 1 pixel width. And that's why when you use width of 306 pixel, then all of that will fit into one row. but it doesn't matter here. We can just go with 300 and see how two things wrap to the next row. And in case you're wondering, you can still use the same alignment arguments that we've learned before. So you could use justify content and it will treat each row individually and space things around like that. So that's how you could create a grid-like structure with Flexbox. But as we'll see in the next video, the grid system is much nicer for that. But in any case, there is still one more thing that I wanted to show you, namely how to move things around when the surrounding container is not a Flexbox. So for example, if we remove all of this part here, then by default everything will be stacked on top of each other. And now let's get rid of these containers here so that we're left with one red square inside of our gray square. Now if I wanted to move my one red square around, then of course I could make the parent container, this one here, make it into a Flexbox, and then use justify content to move this one square around. We've learned it already. But sometimes you don't want to do that because this might affect a whole lot of other things too that are nested inside of that container that you turn into a Flexbox. So that's why instead you can turn the container that you want to move around into a Flexbox. So that's why you set display to flex in there. And we don't need that flex shrink here anymore. And by default, this will not change anything. The only difference is now that this container is a Flexbox. And this means that you can use auto margins on this. So if you'd use margin left and set it to auto, then everything would be right aligned because it will automatically fill the left margin as much as it can. And if you do that with margin right, it will do the same thing just the other way around, but we wouldn't see anything here because it looks like it's just default aligned to the left. But the nice thing about this is that if you use margin left and margin right at the same time and set both of these to auto, then automatically both of these margins will be filled evenly, and that way you get a nice center alignment. But beware that this doesn't work with margin top. So if you'd set that to auto, then you'd see that nothing changes. It is only the margin on the primary axis that works here. And I was about to say that this is really a unique Flexbox thing, but it turns out that if you in this scenario do not make this thing a Flexbox, then you can still get the same result with the auto margins, which is weird, and I'm not 100% sure why this is happening here. So this means just take this last tip with a grain of salt. Apparently this auto margin thing works sometimes without the Flexbox, but I am pretty sure that I have seen occasions where using this auto margins trick on anything but a Flexbox didn't work. But oh well, maybe things changed under the hood here or something. In any case, if you encounter this problem, try out using a Flexbox instead of just using the regular thing. But in any case, with that, we have concluded our video for today. Hope you found this useful. Let me know in the comments if you did. And if you enjoyed this video, you might also enjoy the other videos from the web development for R series. And if you're not into web development, and I'm wondering why you'd watch all the way until the end of this video. But still, if you also enjoy some other things than web development, then check out this series next, where I show you how to create elaborate charts with ggplot. So thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.